right, no handout tonight, as you can probably tell, or at least I hope nobody's passing them out. No? Okay. If you were here last week, we studied Daniel chapter 2, and I talked a little bit about the statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw in the dream that Daniel interpreted, but we just kind of covered kind of the general points of Daniel chapter 2. And so last week I told you guys, I said I want to kind of look at this statue a little bit more and talk about it. And talked a little bit. I didn't ask Will before I did this, but I asked him this week. I said, is that going to mess you up whenever you teach the last part of the book of Daniel? And he said, no. He said, I think it'll help, in fact. So hopefully when he gets over to Daniel chapter 7 and chapter 8, you'll have a little bit of an understanding about some of the visions that he sees, and maybe you can remember some of the stuff that we're going to look at here tonight. But I wanted to start here, and you can kind of be looking down in chapter 2, down about verse 29, about verse 30. That's where we're going to kind of begin tonight and talk a little bit. I wanted to start with the idea of, or the question, why did Nebuchadnezzar see this statue in this dream? Because we know, where'd the dream come from, or from who did the dream come? God. It was a divine dream that God gave to Nebuchadnezzar, right? So why did he see the statue? What was the purpose of this dream? Okay, yeah, foretelling, prophecy of the future. I want you to we're going to look just a little bit here in verse 29, if you want to look down there with me or read along with me. Of course, Daniel is standing before the king and kind of talking about interpreting the dream itself. But remember, I think I mentioned this briefly last week, but he says, as for thee, O king, thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed, what should come to pass hereafter. And he that revealeth secrets maketh known to thee what shall come to pass. So we talked a little bit about this idea. You know, Nebuchadnezzar was laying down at night, and what was he thinking about? Okay, yeah, the dream, but specifically, why did God give him this dream? What was going through his mind? The future, right? What does the future hold? And Nebuchadnezzar was contemplating his future, undoubtedly, but also the future of his empire. What would happen in the future with him? What would happen with this great empire that he had built? And I think everybody, at one time or another, probably more as you get older than probably when I was younger, but do you ever just stop and think about this? What kind of legacy am I going to leave behind? You know, if my name is mentioned, what are people going to think about? And that was basically Nebuchadnezzar. You know, what's my legacy going to be? How long am I going to last? How long is this empire going to last? And that was the question and the thoughts that were running through his mind, and he got what he was looking for. In fact, he got a lot more than what he was looking for, because his question was, what's going to come to pass? What's going to happen in the future? And what God does through this dream is he gives him actually kind of a 600-year glimpse into the future and some of the things that are going to happen therein. I want you to look at verse 30 here, though, for just a moment, because I think also in verse 30, Daniel continues and kind of reveals why this dream was made known to him. But as you look through verse 30 there, of course, Daniel pointed out, you know, he says, it's not me. I didn't know. It wasn't because of some extraordinary ability or wisdom or understanding that I had that nobody else had that this dream was given. It was because God revealed it to me. But he talks about in the middle of that verse, he said, but for our sakes that shall make known the interpretation to the king, and then that thou mightest know the thoughts of thy heart. So really, I think there's two reasons that God gives this dream. If you look at those two things, they're kind of highlighted here. What would you say those reasons are? Yeah, undoubtedly, it's for, and you might there's kind of, depending on which version or translation you read here, there's kind of more than one way that you could interpret or translate this, but some versions actually have it for the sake of the living. In other words, so that humanity could know that God had this plan, and He foretold it, and it was going to happen. He foretold about it 600 years before it ever came to pass. And certainly, even as we're still studying today, it is for our benefit, isn't it? We're still, those of us who are alive, we're still, well, I guess we're all alive, but it is for the benefit of the living. But it was also for the benefit of, Daniel says here, our sakes. The fact that God gave Nebuchadnezzar this dream, and Daniel was able to reveal it and interpret it for him, it elevated Daniel in a foreign kingdom, didn't it? It gave him a position of authority and power and influence that he would not have had otherwise, were it not for God giving this dream to Nebuchadnezzar. And I think what it helped to do is it helped secure, or maybe I should say give the Israelites a more secure position in a foreign kingdom. Because Daniel was part of that nation and part of that empire. Certainly it didn't give them freedom, but it did give them kind of a status that they would not have otherwise had it not been for Daniel and his background. But God, Daniel pointed that out. It was for our sakes that this interpretation of the king was made known. Go ahead. Oh, didn't have a comment? Thought you were raising your hand there. Sorry. The second thing was, he mentions in the last part of verse 30, he says that thou mightest know. So Nebuchadnezzar was sitting there asking, I wonder what the future holds for me. I wonder what's going to happen to me. I wonder what's going to happen to my empire. And God reveals himself to Nebuchadnezzar and to Babylonia, doesn't he? These are some of those stories. A lot of times, I know I make mention of this from time to time, but really the majority of the history, national history, or you might even say the history of mankind that we have, is Jewish in nature. We don't have the records of everything God did with and how he interacted with other nations and things like that, but we do know that Romans chapter 1 says he revealed himself in such a way that the Gentile world was without excuse. And I think this is one of those instances where because of this dream, Nebuchadnezzar gets to know Jehovah God. And what he understands, of course, through this dream, as we're going to talk about a little bit later on, is this was Daniel's God. This was the God who had given him, according to Daniel, his position of authority and his kingdom and all the people and the nations and the languages of it. But it was for the benefit of the king, too, so that God could reveal himself to Nebuchadnezzar, make himself known to him, and really make himself known to the most powerful world empire at that time. And so the point that I'm trying to make here is God had reasons for doing what he did and for sending this dream. And it wasn't just so that to satisfy the curiosity of man of what's going to happen in the future. So let's talk a little bit about what he saw. If you read Daniel chapter 2 and verses 31 through 35, here's what it says. Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. The image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. Thou sawest till a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them, and the stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So what we want to do is spend our time a little bit talking about this dream and the meaning of it. And of course, if you go down to verse 36, Daniel points out, he says, this is the dream, and we're going to tell you the interpretation of it. So we have a divine record of exactly what this dream meant. So this was a pretty peculiar side if you think about it. This terrible, this awesome statue that Nebuchadnezzar sees in his dream. The head is made out of gold. The arms and the chest are made out of silver. Thighs, belly made out of brass. Legs made out of iron. Feet were made out of iron and clay. And so we're going to talk a little bit about this dream, the interpretation of it, and really the significance of it in understanding what God had planned for the future of mankind. And that's really what this dream is all about. So basically, as you study through Daniel, and again, like I said, we'll get into it more in chapter 7 and chapter 8, but there were 4 world kingdoms or empires that were represented by this statue. And of course, you start out with the head of gold. In verse 36 there of Daniel 2, Daniel says, "Thou, O king, art a king of kings." He's talking to Nebuchadnezzar. "For the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory." And so notice how Daniel starts the meaning or the revelation of this dream. He tells Nebuchadnezzar that his kingdom and his power and his strength and his glory has come from who? Yeah, the God of the Israelites, right, in the mind of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, remember when we started studying in Daniel chapter 1, if you read the first 2 verses of Daniel chapter 1, you read about how in the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim, Nebuchadnezzar comes up against Jerusalem, takes it captive, besieges it. And why did all that happen? Was it just some random act of humanity? That's right. God was punishing his people, right? God was punishing the Israelites for their disobedience. And in fact, I think it says in verse 2 there of Daniel chapter 1, the Lord gave these people or in this place into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. So why was Nebuchadnezzar in this position? Why did he have all this authority? Why did he have this great kingdom and this power and all this strength? It's because God put him there. God was using him for a purpose to accomplish his will at this particular time. It was to punish his people by carrying them into captivity for their disobedience. And so Daniel starts out by making known to Nebuchadnezzar, listen, you're where you are and you've got the empire that you've got because of the God of heaven, Jehovah God. And he gave you this dream, and he gave it to you for the purpose so that you'll know the future. That's what you wanted to know, right? You were laying in your bed, you were pondering, you were thinking about, I wonder what the future holds for me and for my empire. Well, the God of heaven wants you to know that this is what's going to happen. And so a couple of things to emphasize. First of all, Daniel wants him to know that Jehovah God, his God, the God of the Israelites, is behind Nebuchadnezzar's success and not all these false gods that he's out here worshiping. They didn't have anything to do with or how you got where you are. Basically, Daniel was telling them, this was all about God, Jehovah God, and what he wanted. And so that's why you are where you are and why you have what you do. And the second thing I think that would probably be important to point out is he wanted Nebuchadnezzar to know he didn't do it by himself. Did Nebuchadnezzar have a problem with pride? Yeah. In fact, there's going to be about, is it 7-year period or something that because of his pride, I think in Daniel chapter 4, he ends up living like a wild animal, right? Until he recognizes that, hey, God, Jehovah God, is the one who's in control. And so Daniel from the get-go wants him to know you're not where you are because you're so powerful and you're so smart and all the abilities that you have. You're here because God put you here. And so you have an important role in this plan that God has. Go ahead, Danny. You got a comment or question? Yeah.
Form was
it's just saying there, the brightness was, it was top notch. So it was super bright. Probably, I don't want to liken it to the appearances of God, but, blinding image. And it was one of the reactions I think you see a lot of times to the manifestation of God is fear. And that's really what that word terrible, at least that's what it meant in 1611 when the King James Version was translated. But that's more the idea of fear. Well, yeah, it made him afraid, the appearance of it. Yeah. So, somebody else, do you have your hand up? Yeah. Awesome? Okay, yeah. It wasn't an ordinary sight. It was certainly something that you would remember if you saw it. And again, a lot of times when you see things that are out of the ordinary, it's uncomfortable, especially when you see them for the first time. But anyway, he's wanting Nebuchadnezzar to know from the beginning, again, that this is from God, Jehovah God, the God of the Israel, Daniel's God, we might say. It's all about him and what he wants out of Nebuchadnezzar and basically why he is where he is. Notice in verse 38 what he says. He says, "Wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven, hath he given into thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold." So one of the interesting things about the Babylonian Empire, if you kind of study, and I don't know, if you're familiar with Bible geography, you'll probably recognize some of these places and areas on these maps. If you haven't spent a lot of time in Bible geography, I'd encourage you to kind of do that. And it helps in a lot of ways. But if you look at the extent of the Babylonian Empire, now basically the Israelites and the area of Palestine is just a very small part of this empire. You look over toward the Mediterranean Sea, and on the east coast there, the Mediterranean Sea, that's where you would find the area of Palestine. Not the whole coast, just a little part of it down, I guess you'd say the bottom right-hand corner toward it, or almost the middle of it. But the Babylonian Empire, where basically in any direction Nebuchadnezzar wanted to go, God let him go. And so remember we talked about Egypt. He conquered Egypt, defeated the Egyptians, inherited their territory. That included the land of the Israelites. Also, if you go further east on your map, kind of northeast, the Assyrians were the major world power before the Babylonians. That included the area of Assyria. You go down toward the southeastern corner there, the bottom right, that's really the kind of the land of Babylon. That's kind of where the heart of Babylon itself, the city. But it was a pretty vast empire. And when you read about it, you read about it wherever the children of men dwelt, the beasts of the field, the fowls of the air, God gave it into their hand. Well, did Nebuchadnezzar rule every part of the entire world, the globe? No. But God did give him vast dominion in basically whatever area or direction his ambition led him. So God had delivered all these things into his hands, and here's the interpretation we're given in verse 28 or 38 there. Daniel says, "You are the head of gold." Now, he wasn't necessarily meaning that Nebuchadnezzar himself was the head of gold, but the Babylonian Empire. Nebuchadnezzar, as a person, stood for the Babylonian Empire. And so he had built this empire. He had conquered all these areas. And now God tells him, "You're this head of gold." And really, if you study about Nebuchadnezzar, he was one of the most powerful Gentile kings to ever reign. The Babylonian Empire didn't last a long time, though. It only lasted about 100 years before it was dethroned by another world empire. And I say it didn't last long. That's kind of, I guess you could say, in comparison to some of these other world powers that you read and study about. But it was certainly one of the most powerful and one of the most glorious kingdoms in the ancient time. Here's what I learned in the beginning, though. these medals and this statue are not going to represent, tiny little countries or small nations over here, or nobody kings. They're representative of world powers. And we recognize that in the beginning from Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire. And so it goes to follow that as you go down, you progress through here, we're not talking about small nations or empires. We're talking about world powers. And as they're represented in this statue. That's, I don't want to get too deep, but that's pretty important when you get over into Daniel 7 and 8 and you start talking about the horns and all these other things. We're talking about world powers, not small nations. So, but you look back over them, they didn't encompass the entire globe, but they did kind of encompass the majority of the historical nations of their time. And so Babylon was the key figure in this, and that dream kind of established a pattern by which you can go down and say, well, these others had to be world empires too, not just tiny, hole in the wall somewhere. So he talks about, first of all, the Babylonian Empire. Well, now what comes next? Well, then you have the chests and the arms of silver, right? What did that represent? Well, Daniel says this in verse 39, and again, when Will gets into chapter 7 and 8, it'll become more apparent this is who the nations are, because it just flat out says it. I'm just kind of trying to give you a background here to work off of as we look at this chapter. But he says in verse 39, after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee. So another world power was going to come into a place whenever the Babylonian kingdom faded out. I don't know if after thee is a reference to the idea that Nebuchadnezzar's, this is going to happen after your death, or if it's just again talking about, well, Nebuchadnezzar, representative of the Babylonian Empire. After this, there's another empire that's going to come into power. But anyway, Nebuchadnezzar gets the news, and it's not completely good news, but your empire is going to fall. Right? Your empire is going to be replaced by another kingdom or another empire. But he says this one is going to be inferior to your empire. So here's a good question. When you study the Medes and the Persians, and that's really the next world empire in this area if you're studying it, how was the kingdom of the Medes and Persians inferior to Babylonia? Yeah, if you actually look on a map, it wasn't inferior in size, was it? It was actually bigger. It was bigger than the Babylonian kingdom. And here's this is the interesting thing about these world empires, because as they come into power, they not only have their land in their area, but then they inherit all the land in the area of the former world empire. And so what happens is this kingdom just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so now you have them, they've inherited everything that Babylon had. That's the Medes and the Persians. But they also, if you look toward the east, that was the area of the Medians. And so that was their original homeland or their original area. But then they conquered the Babylonians, and so now they inherited Babylon, they inherited Assyria, they inherited Israel, they inherited Egypt, and they even expanded westward. There's one little place up there, though, if you look in the top left-hand corner of the map in green, one place they didn't get was Greece. And that becomes important in our next world empire. But they were not inferior in size in any way. I think the inferior part of them, like Will was talking about, it was really the kingdom itself. They didn't have the power and the dominion, the force that the Babylonian Empire had. And in fact, their government, their system of government was a pretty weak system, because you had a lot of the power divided up throughout the empire. In Babylon, you had one guy and he controlled it all. But with the Medes and the Persians, you had a lot of different people divided up in a lot of different ways. And so there wasn't like the dominion, like one guy had all the control and the dominion and authority like under the the Babylonian Empire. Kind of interesting side note here, though. The Medes were actually, well, before this, they were allies with Babylon. They actually worked together with Babylon to conquer the Assyrians. So they worked together to conquer that world power, and then Babylon kind of became the world power, and then the Medes turned on the Babylonians, and they took over their empire. So they were working together when it came to the conquering, though, of Assyria. Notice there's not a whole lot that's said about this kingdom except it's going to be inferior to yours.
Was it Cyrus the Great?
Yeah. So he would be part of that, right? Well, the main part of it, yeah. But it lasted, is it 200 or 300 years? Do you remember? A little over 200 years. So we kind of talked about how Babylon, not that long of a world empire for 100 years, but lasted about twice as long as Babylon did here. So not a whole lot that's said about it. But there is mention, the next mention, of course, is in verse 39 of Daniel 2. It says, another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth. So you have Babylon, then you had the Medes and the Persians, and the next world empire that came on the map were the Grecians. Alexander the Great was the one who kind of led that conquest. He was infatuated with conquering the world. That was his goal. And he probably would have conquered a lot more than what he did, but he actually died at a relatively young age. He died at the age of 32 years old. And so there was a lot of, some people thought he got poisoned, whatever. Some people said, nah, he just got sick and died. But he died at a relatively young age. If he hadn't, he probably would have went a lot farther west, or Greece probably would have went a lot farther west than what they actually ended up being. That was kind of his goal and ambition, to spread out toward the west and to conquer more territory then. But it is mentioned here, and again, if you were to take a map and kind of look at it and say, well, how big is the area of the Grecian Empire? Well, again, you're growing, aren't you? Because now you got everything that was there before, but remember that little corner up there of Greece? Now you got all of Greece too. So you have Macedonia, you have Thrace, those areas up in there. Those are all, play a part in the biblical role in the New Testament. A lot of stories take place from these particular areas. Remember, Paul sees the Macedonian man in a vision saying, come over and preach the gospel to us. Well, that's part of the area. So the Grecians inherit all the Medes and the Persians, everything that they had conquered, and now they add their own land to the mix too. And you just getting these kingdoms that is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so notice what's said of this kingdom, though, in verse 39. It shall bear rule over all the earth. Well, this is the biggest world empire thus far. This is the biggest area, the biggest conquering of any of these empires that we've read about thus far. And the unity of the Grecian Empire was unmatched. It was the most united empire among all these four world empires that we read about here. Got to move on here. I didn't think I'd get very far. I was right. But if you look in verse 40 there, it says, the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron. For as much as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things, and as iron that breaketh all these things, shall it break in pieces and bruise. And so you have the Babylonians, you have the world empire represented by the gold. You have the Medes and the Persians represented by the silver. You have the Grecian Empire that's represented by the brass or the bronze. Now we're down to the fourth empire, the Roman Empire, represented by the iron. The Roman Empire, this is kind of interesting side note, but one of the things that it was known for was its weaponry of iron. There was kind of a shift at this time in the materials that were used in conducting a lot of these weapons. And it's not to say that they didn't have weapons of iron before. They just didn't have all weapons of iron. And so the Romans, they were masters of taking something, an idea that somebody else had, and perfecting that idea. You remember that? You'll see that in crucifixion. They didn't invent crucifixion, but they perfected it. They made an art out of it of torture. And so they took a practice that had been around for a long time. I think even the Median kings, whenever they conquered Babylonia, I think they crucified some of the leaders of Babylon. So it was a method of death that had been around for a long time. The Romans just took it and perfected it to the utmost, to a method of torture. And that's what they did with this irons and these weapons of iron. They were a powerful army in part because of the weapons that they had. And so they were one of the most fearsome military powers of the world empires that has ever been seen. But what happens when you go down, you start looking at the feet of this empire? What was it mixed with? Clay. Well, how hard do you think, or how good do you think iron and clay mixed together? Not at all. So there were a lot of weaknesses within the Roman Empire itself. Although it was strong militarily, there are a lot of weaknesses from the Roman Empire itself. And if you notice in verse 41 there of Daniel 2, it says, "Whereas thou sawest the feet and the toes, part of potter's clay, part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. But there shall be in it the strength of iron, forasmuch as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay." The interesting thing about the Roman Empire, a lot of these empires that you see, and we talked about Babylon in the beginning of the book of Daniel here, when they conquered an area, what did they do to the people in that area? Yeah, they basically tried to indoctrinate them, didn't they? They removed them from their natural dwelling place. They put them in other places. They tried to train them to be Babylonians. Roman Empire didn't do that. Roman Empire went out, they conquered you. They say, now you're going to pay us money. You owe us taxes. As long as you pay your taxes, you guys can pretty well operate like you used to. And so what that did is it didn't unite the kingdom as one, like the Grecian Empire. And you had all these places. Were they part of the Roman Empire? Yeah, but were they loyal Romanists? No. And in fact, whenever Rome finally falls, a lot of these smaller nations and areas that they conquered actually fight against Rome in order to get free of their rule. And we often say that Rome fell from within. Well, it did. I mean, its own citizens basically helped overthrow it. But that's representative of that clay in the iron. It was strong militarily, but not united front. And so that resulted in a divided kingdom. Now, so you have all these world empires, and you know, this basically, we're out of time here. If you were to look at the Roman Empire on a map, you can kind of, again, west, we're going farther west, farther and farther west every time with these world empires. But the prophecy is given in Daniel 2:44, "In the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed." In the days of which kings? The Romans. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar sees this stone that's cut out of the side of the mountain, and where does the stone hit the statue? Yeah, in the Roman Empire, right? In the days of these kings, in the days of this empire, and the kings of this empire, God is going to set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. He goes on to say that kingdom won't be left to other people. It will break into pieces, consume all these kingdoms. So, in the days of these kings is a reference to the fourth kingdom, the Roman Empire. Listen to the characteristics of this kingdom that God's going to establish. It shall never be destroyed. Well, what happened to all these other kingdoms that Nebuchadnezzar saw in these dreams? They rose and they fell, right?
What was the average on the rest of them that they lasted?
Medes and Persians, about 200 years. Grecians, 300. Romans were, what, 500? Somewhere in that area, 600. So basically the timeline is 600 years, though, because remember in 606 BC is when Nebuchadnezzar comes against Jerusalem, and then you have till in the days of these kings, God's going to set up this kingdom. AD, we say 33, but somewhere in that area. But that's about 600 years. But the Roman Empire actually lasted 400 years, 500 years after Christ. So, but that kingdom that God's going to set up is never going to be destroyed. It's unlike this dream that Nebuchadnezzar has had, where kingdom after kingdom is being conquered. It's not going to be left to other people. What happened to these kingdoms? Well, when they were done, they left everything they had to somebody else, didn't they? The next person in line got it. God's kingdom is not going to be left to other people. And so you have this idea. God sets up the kings and the kingdoms on earth. God gives the kingdom of men to whoever he chooses. But the kingdom that God sets up not going to be taken over by men. It's not going to be left to anybody else to be taken over. It's going to break in pieces all these kingdoms. When that stone hit that statue, what happened to all those other pieces? Or all these kingdoms? They just turned into dust, right? The wind blew them away like they were never there. But nothing in this world is going to be victorious over this kingdom that God's going to set up in these days. That's really the message. I mean, that's the message of the book of Daniel. That's the message of the book of Revelation, right? This kingdom that God is going to set up, no other kingdom or no other person is going to be able to defeat it. Going to be able to win a victory over it. And, of course, in verse 45, he talks about that stone that was cut out of the mountain. It wasn't made with hands. What does that mean? Yeah, divinely made, not human made. How did Christ get here? Was it through the means of human beings? It was by the hand of God, wasn't it? God sent his son to this earth through the virgin birth. The stone utterly destroys all these other kingdoms. What happens to the stone? Yeah. He says the stone fills the entire earth, doesn't it? Where's the Lord's church today? It's all over, isn't it? It wasn't like those other world empires where you said this is where they are, this section of the earth. This stone was going to become a mountain, and it was going to fill the entire earth. Jesus built the kingdom of God, which is the church. The church spread across the world, and today that's God's kingdom all over the world. Still here, isn't it? What about all those other kingdoms? Gone. So that's really the message that's being sent. It's not really just about world powers. It's about this great kingdom that God would build, and that would last forever, and that would never be, no other nation or kingdom or person is ever going to win the victory over. Never going to be able to destroy it. Go ahead. Yeah.
Rome, infrastructure, Greece, common language that everybody spoke. All of those things need to be in place for the gospel to be able to go throughout the world.
Yeah, God used those world empires to set the stage for the coming of Christ. And like Will said, all of them contributed something. The Romans had, one of the things that they did is they built roads everywhere. They made travel easy, and that helped the gospel spread throughout the entire world. The Grecians brought a universal language. Greek was the universal language of Jesus' day and age. Well, that was important for the gospel to spread like it spread. And so all these kingdoms, they contributed, Medes and Persians, the idea of law. Law means what it says and says what it means. You can't change it or alter it. Well, that's God's word, right? But they all contributed to that, and that wasn't by accident. God had designed all these things. So, all right, appreciate all your comments, questions, and Lord willing, next week we'll pick up with Daniel chapter